Matt Long, but as you can see, Scott Doney is not Matt Long. Matt Long, unfortunately, is having some severe back pain, was unable to make it to today's presentation. Thankfully, Scott is a co-author on his talk, and so Scott will be giving the talk and impersonating Matt Long.
And for those of you who are also here at Woods Hole, this is the Matt Long from in-car, not the Matt Long from Woods Hole. So Matt sent me his slides. I'm hoping the talk complements well the material we've already had in this session, particularly some of the material that Marina just talked about in terms of looking at physical fluxes. So here's an outline of the talk. I'm going to start by discussing some of the large Earth system models that are used in the IPCC framework to estimate things like ocean carbon uptake and the sensitivity of that uptake to long-term climate change. Then dig down a little bit more into some of the specific physical dynamics in the model and some of the long-term effects of ocean warming on ocean carbon uptake. And then, if we have time, look at some of the known biases, at least in one of the models, the community Earth system model from NCAR, a model that Matt and I have been working on with many other colleagues for a number of years. So this is very similar to the framework that Galen started out with this morning, is we're interested in the large-scale carbon cycle in the framework of an evolving Earth system. The work we're going to be presenting is based on Earth system models that are a physical and biogeochemical encapsulation of that into a model framework. It's got all the large-scale atmosphere and ocean physics, sea ice. It's usually encapsulated into a series of modules. So up in the right-hand corner, there would be an atmosphere model, an ocean model, a land surface model, and maybe a sea ice or cryosphere model. They're coupled together with a numerical coupler that exchanges fluxes between the different components. And these models, there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that they conserve energy and conserve mass between these different components. Because it's a full Earth system model, there's natural variability within the model. And so one of the challenges in comparing these fully coupled Earth system models to observations is that the models have their own El Nino, La Nina cycle that's independent in phasing from observations. And so we often end up doing statistical evaluations of the interannual decadal variability. You can't look at specific events, but you can look at some statistical aggregate. These models can be run as standalone in a pre-industrial state, so you can look at natural variability. They can also be run with external perturbations, and particularly the ones I'm going to be looking at today are fossil fuel emissions of carbon dioxide and other perturbations to the CO2 system, as well as other greenhouse gases, things like chlorofluorocarbons and methane. And then finally, more on the modeling side, these models are now being set up so that some of the components are interchangeable, so that if you don't like the ocean model that we chose, you could take, for example, the French ocean model, and hopefully in not too distant future, be able to mix and match those to really get at what is common between the models and what is specific to the models in terms of the signals and biases we're seeing. So Galen showed a similar plot to this up to the present, where the positive, the red line is the fossil fuel emissions. So this is, in this case, the flux. So we're here at about 2016, where the flux is roughly about 10 billion tons of carbon per year, or 10 petagrams. This is a particular scenario from the IPCC, one of these representative concentration pathways where the flux continues to go up in this particular pathway to very high values over the 21st century. We can use the model to then estimate how much CO2 stays in the atmosphere. So this is the growth rate of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the land use change. And I know Galen was talking about the net land flux. In the models, we have to separate them diagnostically because this is often prescribed in some way in terms of deforestation rates of CO2 emissions. The green is the land flux that's then seeing the changing climate and the changing atmospheric CO2. If you combine these two, you'd see that it was a net source. And in some models, depending on where you are, it can actually switch over even larger, where this green flux turns around. And even the land there's so much climate change, the land starts venting, even independent of land use change. And then finally, the blue is the long-term net sink of carbon into the ocean, associated primarily with physical dissolution of CO2 into the surface ocean, and then physical transport mechanisms away from the surface into the ocean interior. We're interested in trying to diagnose. So if we look at this, there's CO2 effects, so rising atmospheric CO2 affects land and ocean sinks, climate change affects land and ocean sinks, and so a number of years ago, the CMIP project and Pierre Friedlingstein developed a linearization to try to separate out these different effects. So you can think of, if you take those fluxes and integrate them over time, you get a cumulative perturbation in the ocean inventory of carbon. Another way of thinking of that would be the carbon inventory at one point of time versus the carbon inventory for some control. And so if there's net flux into the ocean, over time you'd build up a cumulative increase. And this linearization divides that increase into two components. The first component, often called the beta term, is the component driven by the fact that atmospheric CO2 is going up. We know if you drive up atmospheric CO2, you drive a PCO2 differential. This is what Galen was talking about earlier. That drives a flux into the ocean. The second component is a climate change component, sometimes called the gamma term. Sorry for the notation, not my notation, but it's become standard within this community. And the idea is that these are roughly two terms that can be separated. We separate them out by running a set of sensitivity experiments of different types. In some of the sensitivity experiments, we're only varying atmospheric carbon dioxide. In other sensitivity experiments, we're only varying or allowing certain components to see climate change. And in some, we're allowing both rising atmospheric CO2 and changing climate. I won't go into the details of this. This is sort of at the level, if you're really interested in specific model, how to actually do the model calculation. But what you end up with is a breakdown where you have the total. So this would be if you did everything, climate change and rising CO2 at the same time. And we hope it's through this linearization, a sum of a component that's just due to rising atmospheric CO2, and then two terms, one due to climate change on the natural background biogeochemical state of the ocean. So this is if the circulation changes and you have a change in how much rich CO2 water in the deep ocean gets brought up to the surface, changes in the biological pump, that would affect this term. And this last term is the climate change driven by changes in how much anthropogenic CO2 is taken up. So there's really two climate change terms, a natural background term, and then a term associated with anthropogenic CO2, where this is actually a change in the circulation. So if you slow the circulation down, you'll be bringing in less CO2 from the surface ocean, less of that anthropogenic fossil fuel CO2 into the deep ocean, but simultaneously you might be bringing up less CO2 from below, and there's an interplay where in some places the anthropogenic CO2 term might win out, in other places the background CO2 term may win out. And we'll look at that in a little more detail. So this was one of the primary results out of the CMIP5 process. So this is the fifth climate model, coupled model intercomparison project. These were idealized simulations, so we weren't trying to mimic what we think might happen, but just a very idealized simulation where atmospheric CO2 was prescribed to rise at 1% per year. So this is a simple exponential growth curve. And what you see is that atmospheric CO2 rises very rapidly. in over 140 years, you get up to close to 1,200 parts per million. That turns out to be, it's a very useful simulation. Turns out to not be exactly what we need, and I'll show that result later on. So with prescribed atmospheric CO2, we can then look at the fluxes for these various different simulations. So we can look at the atmosphere-ocean flux. The red line is basically the flux that happens without the ocean seeing this rising atmospheric CO2, but seeing the radiative climate effects of atmospheric CO2. So this is in effect a measure of climate sensitivity, and these two simulations are measures of the ocean's ability to take up CO2 under natural climate conditions and perturbed warmed climate conditions. So that's the background, and that's the climate change. If you look down here, what you see, this red line, is again some measure of climate change. It's relatively small, so this is that gamma term. And these are these are beta and beta plus gamma. So most of the signal is associated with rising atmospheric CO2. The climate change impact or sensitivity is a small perturbation on that. A lot of work has gone into how small. One way of framing this is now for the CESM model. So we're going into a little bit more detail than what was shown in CMIP5, is to actually look at the change in the inventory of carbon in the ocean as a function of PCO2. So if this was perfectly linear, you'd have the same beta coefficient in this linearization. So it would be beta times atmospheric PCO2, you'd have the same value. It tends to have a slight curvature. That's that saturation effect, that the thermodynamics of the CO2 system, as you add more CO2, the ocean becomes less effective. But it continues up with time. And it's a large term. You're seeing delta inventory changes up to about 600 petagrams. By comparison, when you look at the climate change terms, these are these various gamma terms, the total gamma is only about 50 petagrams, so only about 1/10 as large as the CO2 effect. And most of it ends up being due to effects of climate change on ocean circulation, slowed ocean circulation that takes up less anthropogenic CO2. In this particular model, the effects of climate change on the natural background, so changes in circulation and changes in the biological pump, mostly cancel out. So this natural background is actually pretty small. The anthropogenic term is pretty large. For those aficionados who get really into this particular paper didn't do a good job of including that anthropogenic term. So this number is probably bigger. It's probably more down here. It's still not as large as the CO2 term, but it's a little bit larger probably if we did this full analysis for all the models than what was initially reported. So let's dig into a little bit more detail, and this is complements the previous talk where we're looking at the different physical effects within the ocean model and what are the different physical terms that are transporting CO2 from the surface ocean into the deep ocean and from the deep ocean into the surface ocean. So very similar to the decomposition that Marina talked about, we have export production, which in this case is the biological sinking. I'm not going to focus as much on physical transport of organic matter, just the gravitational term. We have diapycnal mixing. So this is strong in the mixed layer, decreases through the seasonal thermocline and permanent thermocline. We have isopycnal mixing. So this is mixing along density surfaces. We have eddy advection. So in addition to isopycnal mesoscale effects of mixing along density surfaces, mesoscale eddies also tend to want to flatten the large scale when you have gradients in the density surfaces. So for example, if you have density surfaces in the Southern Ocean that are sloping up to the surface, the mesoscale eddies will tend to try to flatten that density structure. And it tends to act in an opposite set effect to the resolved advection. So the resolved advection is trying to push up those density surfaces. The mesoscale effect is trying to push them down. And you'll see opposing terms in terms of the physical contribution to CO2 transport from the resolve and the eddy advection. Sometimes this is called bolus advection. You might also see this as in the Jim McWilliams parameterization. There's lots of different nomenclature out there. So let's take a look at what this looks like. I'm going to start with the control simulation. So the numbers here are the total fluxes. These are vertical fluxes over the globe, integrated over the entire simulation. So that's why they're so large. They're out to, you know, we don't have 2,000 petagrams of sinking biological carbon per year. It's 2,000 petagrams over the entire length of the simulation. What you see for the biological flux is the flux starts off very small at the surface. It builds up because you have more biology. They're adding material that's sinking out, and then it starts to decay because of remineralization. So there's the positive terms here are downward fluxes. So the biology is stripping carbon out of the surface ocean. The natural control simulation is roughly in balance. So this biological term has to then be compensated for by physical fluxes, upward physical fluxes. They're a combination of, in red, the horizontal resolved, or sorry, the resolved advection term in red. Right near the surface, diapicnal mixing, so mixing across the seasonal thermocline into the mixed layer. And then a little bit of this, of the the isopycnal mixing term. And then you see a sub-mesoscale parameterization. So this is just a parameterization. We're not running the model at sub-mesoscale, but we have incorporated a parameterization of physical effects. And then this eddy term, this bolus term, that's partially compensating the resolved advection. So biology is taking it down, and then you have a series of physical terms, and particularly as you get towards the surface, some of these terms get stronger. Particularly the diapicnal term and the submesoscale term are very important right near the surface as you move down through the water column. Large-scale horizontal advection and isopycnal mixing along density surfaces takes over. So it's actually an interplay of physical terms. If we were to change the parameterization in the model, change how we parameterize some of the mesoscale effects, you'd see a shift between these different terms, but they'd eventually come to a new balance, both between the physics and the biology, but it might be at a different state. I want to show for the CO2 anomaly. In the CO2 anomaly, the net flux is into the ocean, so it's downward everywhere. Right near the surface, it's primarily diapicnal, getting across the mixed layer and then across into the base, the base of the mixed layer into the seasonal and impermanent thermocline. It's then picked up by large-scale advection and also isopycnal mixing. So again, an interplay of these different physical terms with some compensation from the bolus term and the submesoscale. So how do those change with climate? Under climate, this is back to the large scale. So this is the natural pre-industrial state. I said before that it tends to be relatively small in this particular model. It's almost zero, but it's slightly negative. There's a substantial reduction in biology, but that's compensated by less DIC being brought up from below. So if you were to think about, organic matters raining dissolved organic carbon into the deep ocean, that's increasing the CO2 in the deep ocean, that's being brought back up to the surface by physical circulation. If you slow the physical circulation, you're bringing up less CO2-rich water, less nutrient-rich water. These tend to, on a global scale in this model, roughly cancel. But on regional scales, that's going to differ. For anthropogenic CO2, the big effects are reductions in diapicnal mixing because of increased stratification, reductions in isopycnal mixing as well. And then deeper in the ocean, the large-scale advection associated with overturning circulation tends to dominate. Just to show that there's regional variations in these terms, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I do want to emphasize that, as has been shown in many other model studies and observational studies, the Southern Ocean is a key player in this, both in terms of the uptake of CO2 and these various climate sensitivity terms. So I'm going to move, this is to a study by Takahito et al., and Matt's a co-author on this. They looked at a subset of the CMIP5 models. They were very interested in the Southern Ocean in particular and the role the Southern Ocean plays in terms of CO2 uptake and climate sensitivity. So you get, across this range of models, you get warming, freshening, increase in stratification, and also an increase in the intensity of the westerly winds in the southern hemisphere, and also a poleward contraction. But you'll see that there's a large range. All these coupled models have slightly different behavior, even to the same external perturbation. You get a large range in the extent of warming or freshening. They found, quite interestingly, all the models showed a strong uptake of CO2 into the Southern Ocean, as you'd expect. But they also saw changes in the amount of preformed carbon in the Southern Ocean. So less efficient flushing, regenerated carbon. More regenerated carbon in the deep ocean, less efficient flushing of that biological carbon that was gravitationally sinking into the ocean and then being flushed out. There's a strong correlation between regenerated carbon in the deep ocean and the ability of the ocean to store CO2, both from the preformed and the regenerated. They did a series of sensitivity studies. I'm not going to go into detail, just to say that there's a complex interplay of terms in the Southern Ocean, and the Southern Ocean doesn't seem as sensitive, at least in this analysis, to climate change because of this interplay of biological and physical terms. I want to get back to these alpha and beta terms, and Nikki, you'll tell me when I'm coming up on time, right? This is sort of the standard summary of all that work that goes into the IPCC document. You have alpha terms, which are climate sensitivities. I haven't gone into those in much detail. These are for the CMIP4 and the CMIP5. What you see here under the ocean carbon response is CMIP4 had a relatively large beta term. That's saying for a rise in atmospheric CO2, the models are very effective at taking up carbon. A lower value in CMIP5, and also a lower spread. Now, the lower spread may be because we're improving some of the outlier models, but this distinct drop in the beta term probably had more to do with the type of model simulations that were being analyzed rather than an actual conceptual change in our understanding. And in particular, the rate of change of increase in atmospheric CO2 affects the ability of the ocean to take up carbon. If you increase atmospheric CO2 faster, you don't have enough time for CO2 to get into the deep ocean. It's time scale sensitive. These pathways, some of them are decadal, some of them are more like centennial. If you ramp up CO2 really rapidly, you get a smaller beta term because the ocean just can't respond that quickly. In CMIP5, they used this prescribed 1% per year. In CMIP4, they used one of these scenarios that was more like 0.5% per year. A lot of this difference is probably artificial because they didn't do an apples to apples comparison. They did an apples to oranges comparison. The other thing to note is substantial reduction in the climate sensitivity between CMIP4 and CMIP5. Some of this may actually be real because some of these initial models were getting very large sensitivities, probably not consistent with our current understanding. I do want to go into a little bit, now I can't remember, I think Galen may have showed the Randerson. There has been some work, the IPCC framework is sort of stuck on 2100. We've been doing some work going out to 2300 to look at long-term effects. So like, thanks. So this is now a run out, so 2100 is about here. We've now run the model out several hundred additional years. We allow atmospheric CO2 to ramp up and then level out for the last 100 years or so. But what you see if you look at all the physical variables, for example, this is surface stratification. Surface stratification tends to follow CO2. When the radiative forcing stabilizes, the surface ocean stabilizes, temperature stays about the same, but the deep ocean continues to warm. There's a very long time scale or inertia associated with heat inflow into the deep ocean. Similarly, there's a long inertia associated with the ocean uptake of CO2 as the deep ocean continues to see elevated heating, elevated warming, and also elevated CO2. What you get out of that is that over time, if you look at cumulative heat uptake over very long periods of time, we get much larger effects on changing climate on CO2 uptake in the future than we would if we just looked out to 2100. This black line is the 2100 results that were used in the CMIP5 analysis. The gamma tops out at about 10. If you continue to run that out, you get slowing in the meridional overturning, more heat content changes, more changes in circulation, and you get much larger effective climate sensitivities. So when you compare, you know, we may be, our answer that we get may be very dependent on the framework that we've chosen for the analysis of just looking at the 21st century. I want to show one slide and then I'll skip to the conclusions so we have time for questions. These models are imperfect. It's very hard to get a fully coupled system to behave the way you want. It's often not obvious what set of parameters to change, particularly when you're coupling an ocean to an atmosphere to a sea ice. Within the ocean model, we have some knobs, particularly some of the parameterizations of turbulent processes, which are not well known, so there are some variations that we can do. But for example, within the model, this is for CSM, we tend to underestimate, these are for 3 different basins, the amount of anthropogenic CO2 uptake. Similarly, we tend to underestimate the amount of freon uptake. So freons are, if you like, a physical, non-biological analog, more directly measured. These kind of data sets can be used to improve the models. The problem, though, is we've done a lot of work trying to adjust the parameterizations so that we get these right. In the process, we wreck other properties of the coupled system. So there's not always an easy solution. So lots more biases. I'll skip to the end. I do want to just say as a summary that the anthropogenic CO2 transfer into the ocean is really dominated by resolved advection in the mid-latitudes and some of these diapicnal terms at high latitudes that then trade off as the water gets deeper into the ocean. We have a lot of questions about how to parameterize sub-mesoscale and mesoscale dynamics. I think that still remains a major issue. Stratification leads to substantial changes both in anthropogenic CO2 uptake, the biological pump, and this sort of natural background circulation of DIC. And the Southern Ocean, and we'll have some talks later today, is really key to resolving some of these issues. So I'll stop there and take questions.
In order to keep on time, I'll allow one question.
This is really quick. On slide 10, you had a biological line on the anthropogenic plot, and or it was a green line, and I was curious if there's a way you get a yes, on the right-hand side. Is that green line a biological term in the anthropogenic.
Right. There is enough noise in the simulations go their own directions. So you end up getting, there are some small variations, and that's some estimate of how much noise there is when you basically have two independent calculations. What we'd love to do with this is in, 20 on a 20-member ensemble. We don't have the cash to do that right now, but
So but is there an anthropogenic portion of the biological pump in this model somehow, or?
it's, for this particular one, we do by residual.
Okay.
There's not an easy way of doing it, so it ends up being a noise. This is by residual, and some of this ends up some measure of noise.
Thank you.
But we're still writing the paper, so thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to turn it over to Bob.